Hi, everybody. My name is Grace Bubeck, and this is a session of the Healing and Awakening Retreat. And the session is with the teacher is Jon Prendergast. Hi, Jon.
Hi, Grace.
And hello to all of you who are part of this session. And the topic for this session is, let me just call up the session, the greatest intimacy, awakened relating to the apparent other. And this topic has an interesting history in that it came to me to ask Jon to talk about healing and awakening in the context of personal relationships. And Jon said, well, you know, I'm doing this all day long in my practice. You know, I don't want to talk to this. And I said by email, I said, but Jon, you know, that's perfect. I mean, you're the person who talk about this, and it came to me for you to do this. So Jon graciously agreed to take on that topic, and we included what he felt was important to include, which is that intimacy is not just part of personal relationships. It is much larger. It's really ultimately an intimacy with life, with experience, with ourselves. So I'll hand over to Jon, just to say that Jon was actually also on the first Healing and Awakening retreat. And that was a very beautiful session, and I really felt to invite him again. And so, yes, Jon is a psychotherapist, and he's published work on non-dual psychotherapy, and has also taught in that area. So he's got a lot of experience, and also the shall we say the background of reflecting on this, how non-dual awake being can translate into the therapeutic relationship and into being with people in a way that brings that awakeness to the work. So Jon's just a very beautiful, very humble, way too humble person. And I just want to welcome him to this session. We're very blessed to have you, Jon.
Thank you so much, Grace. And welcome to you and everything. Well, nice to be back again.
Yes.
Yeah, it's true. I had a little resistance to the subject, but since we opened it up, it's fine. And it's a very important subject as well, because
Yes.
very often it is in our personal relationships where we get most identified and most attached, and tend to forget who we are. So it's kind of where the rubber hits the road in terms of an integrated and embodied wakefulness, I would say. So it's always a
absolutely
rich and complex topic. So the interesting thing about relationship is that we are just embedded in multiple fields of relationship as human beings. We're related to everything. You know, we're made out of stardust and breathe the common air, and we're so interrelated. We're just learning more and more about how interrelated we are with all of life. So relationship is unavoidable, and it's more or less conscious. And it exists on multiple levels, and we as human beings are multi-dimensional, and relate simultaneously, now speaking with one another on many different levels. We relate to one another mentally, in terms of exchanging thoughts and ideas and images. We relate to each other, one another emotionally as well, in terms of sharing feelings and understanding or misunderstanding them, a very important part of human relationship. We relate to one another physically, depending on our closeness and intimacy as well, and energetically, in terms of the subtle body, and also essentially in terms of beings as well. So all of these are happening, and we relate to each other in terms of our roles and familiarity and closeness, and we form bonds that sometimes are very briefly created and fall apart, and others that last for a lifetime as well. So all of this is happening, this multidimensional relating, and we can describe it in that way kind of objectively. But as we let go of who we think we are, and all the stories and all the images and our history, and as we become increasingly intimate with what's essential as our true nature, we lose our objectivity. We stop objectivizing ourself. We could speak of it as pure subjectivity or beyond objective or subjective, and we feel ourselves simply free and open and available in a profound way, increasingly. And so it's very interesting to feel what happens to what we call relationship as we open to our true nature, because it becomes increasingly less objective. As we stop objectifying or lessen the degree we objectify ourselves, we do that with others and with everything. And we move increasingly out of, I would say, relationship into pure relating. Just a beautiful exchange in the moment that comes from a sense of fullness as well, and a sense of spacious intimacy. So it's very different. If we take ourselves as a separate self, we have a nagging sense of lack, that we're missing something. And we look to the other to fill us in some way. And there's a lot of controlling, consciously and subconsciously, that goes on, trying to get the other to conform to what we want in order to be filled, and also trying to manipulate ourselves as well in order to be what we think the other person wants. So there's a lot of subtle and not so subtle controlling that goes on in ordinary relationships because of the sense of lack. And as we grow in our self-intimacy, in our self-trust, in our sense of the openness of our hearts and the groundedness of our being, the sense of lack diminishes and is replaced by a sense of fullness. And then relationships are very different. We're not in relationship to get, but much more to give. And it's really much more of a generous offering. And interestingly, it begins to feel like everything is in us, including the apparent other. So even though we acknowledge and even celebrate the differences of others, we feel a sense of intimacy, shared essence as well. And so we give the gift of freedom to others. We give the gift of acceptance, to let people be who they are. And it's received as a very precious gift when we know we've been accepted in a profound way. So, our own self-intimacy and our own inner freedom then radiates out. And less do we feel others as really in any way a threat to us, or even a source of ultimate fulfillment, but rather much more as an expression. So, I experience Grace, you know, as a beautiful expression of myself, and as you would express Jon as a beautiful expression of yourself. And this seems to be the most loving form of being together. And to even speak of relationship feels a little bit too much. So there's a sense of both space, openness, really infinite space, and at the same time, tremendous closeness or intimacy. And I think of this as spacious intimacy as well. So anyway, that's a few thoughts to share, and feelings being to share as well, to start our conversation.
Thank you. And, you know, it is interesting how, you know, when you first talked about less objective, relationships become less objective. I was, you know, something didn't quite compute at first. But then I realized that what you're saying is that there's less of an object relationship between.
That's right.
Us and the other. You know, it's like it's almost like the experience just includes everything. And so the other is less of an other. Is that what you meant?
It is what I mean. Yeah, it's this interesting, it's paradoxical to the mind, because when the mind thinks about oneness, it tends to think of everything as the same. But it's really the acknowledgement of a shared ground of being or essence, and brings a remarkable, well, we're talking about love really in the most expansive and purest form, right? So it's a knowing from the inside of the essence of the other. And so the other is, that's why we say the apparent other. It's not a confusion, it's not emerging, it's not, I know that you're not sharing the same thoughts or the same feelings or the same physical experience, but we are sharing the same ground of being as well. And it's not abstract, it's felt. So in that sense, the objectivity dissolves, even as in a certain way, there's a clarification and an acceptance of the differences that we may have as well. There's a respect and even honoring of that.
Yes, totally. And, you know, I don't know about you, but to me, that's still surprising. How that is, that because, you know, I still remember how I used to object to people so much. And in fact, a lot of my identity was constructed around who I liked and who I disliked. Actually, a lot who I hated, because I was very political. And so, you know, I felt justified in hating the capitalists and, you know, I mean, whatever categories I had. I was also a very radical feminist, so of course I hated men. And it's so hard. I just find it so surprising that all of this just fell away, and I can't hate anybody anymore. You know, and in the recent context of the American elections, to bring up a dicey topic, but it just came to bring that up because I think it's a really good example. It's like I didn't seem to find it in me to have any strong opinions about Donald Trump, even though, of course, you know, his politics are almost incomprehensible to me. You know, that there's nothing that resonates in those politics inside my being and my heart. And yet here he is. He's also here as us. He's all the prejudice and the whatever it is that we can get up to ourselves as human beings.
Yeah, whatever elements we see and react to in Donald Trump, we can find in ourselves in some way, perhaps much in minor form, but that's true. It was interesting. I was leading a workshop with Dorothy Hunt, who I know was on a little bit earlier on the program a few weeks ago. In fact, right after the election, and we knew, we had like 40 people. I don't know if she talked about it or not, but people were really.
No, she didn't. She didn't.
Okay.
So I'm glad for you to share that.
Well, we knew that people would be really upset, and I recall the morning before I drove down to be at the retreat, I felt like I needed to sit with Donald and kind of feel what was there, and in a very innocent way. So I just sat in meditation quietly, and it felt like Donald appeared nearby, and it was very interesting because at first the experience was kind of like meeting a hard shell, the persona, and so many of us react to, myself included a little bit. And then without any particular intention, it was as if awareness went through the shell and touched this flame inside. And I realized, oh, this is who he is, really. And, with that experience, it was like whenever there was a sense of really quite spontaneously wishing his own well-being and wishing his own self-recognition. So there were different levels, of that relating. There was a sense of really relating on the level of being, and then also acknowledging on the level of personality. Very, very markable differences, marked differences, and acknowledging both, actually. And I think that's true of anyone that we may have a reaction or judgment about, to know that there's some innocent confusion there, and that people identify very strongly with their beliefs and their worldviews and their histories, and behind that is the flame of knowing and the flame of being and the great heart of reality. And so it's important, I think, to however we move in our personal lives and our political lives, to have a felt sense of that and a remembrance of the being of whomever we're relating to. And more practically, that could be our partner or our friend with whom we're having a conflict or a misunderstanding. We can have our reactions, we can have our judgments, we can have our feelings, but also it's very important to more quietly sense into an essential level and acknowledge that in the other as well.
Yeah. Yes. And feel called to also address what's been part of my past. I mean, living in Canada, of course, I'm not as immediately touched by the presidential elections as Americans are. But I was very strongly reminded during that time, and especially after the elections, of my own need to be with German history, because I'm German by origin. And when I was younger, I felt the pain and the suffering of the Holocaust, and the suffering that was created, that was caused by, the Second World War, and somehow I was very identified with that, and it was almost unbearable for me to know that I was German, that I was carrying this heavy burden of German history.
Mm-hmm.
And it took a long time to really see that this was not about me, and it wasn't about Germans. It was simply about, it was an expression of the kind of ignorance and confusion that can happen in human minds, and that can cause a lot of suffering, and that can be multiplied if it's expressed in politics. And yet at the core, it's simply an expression of this being that expresses in both extremes, the
very
goodness,
loving and very
the
hateful.
goodness of love, and the hatred that creates a lot of pain. And I can see now that I was so ready to hate in terms of my own political stance. And, it just takes what it takes it takes a real coming back to self to see all of this in peace, and to, and it's the same with every personal relationship too. It's like when we take issue, when we, there's always something that invites us to go right back to ourselves and to see what is arising here.
It's so easy to get caught in a story, right? And, if we look at the history of dictators, there's the ones who are just out for their personal gain, and then there's the ones who have an ideology that they're very identified with, and become fervent, believers and advocates for, and enlist millions of people on their behalf, creating enormous suffering. But the root of it is the attachment to that belief, interestingly, to a particular worldview.
Yes.
And so, it's very, it takes a lot of courage, I think, to be able to see our own worldviews as worldviews, to see our own positions as positions, and be willing to let go of them, and feel who we are without them, to be stripped, of these identities, whatever they may be, whether American or German or Canadian, or, our ethnic identities or religious identities, whatever they are. And that's not to devalue them in any way. And I think it's important in this teaching. It's not about pretending as if we don't have these identities or these conditionings. And we can actually celebrate them. It's really important. It's not about erasing them, but it's about knowing what the foundation of them are, and the foundation of who we are. And when we really tap into that experientially and knowingly, then it's as if everything is held, everything is held in that loving being, and finds its natural place, I would say. We don't have to reject anything. We don't have to reject any of our history, whether we were predator or prey. It's all part of who we are and of the human experience, and we can embrace it.
Yes.
Because we've all felt hatred at times, perhaps murderous. Most of us haven't acted on it, but we've had those thoughts and sometimes those feelings as well. We are so quick to see enemies and make them. We're so identified with the in-group, our group, and the other group. We're very wired this way.
Yeah.
And to have compassion and kindness for our group and less for the other group, right? So this is the great work, in a way, is to expand the circle of empathy, expand the circle of love, to be increasingly inclusive, to feel ourselves more as listeners, to make greater allowances and more acceptance as well. And this invites true nature to come forward as well.
My sense is, I don't know whether that's also your sense, is that as we receive others as they are, there's also a fuller expression of how life expresses here, somehow the ideas of how things should be or how people should behave, all that drops away, and then there's simply it's almost like a kind of, it's almost like a kind of, oh, so this is what's here. I never realized,
There's a real discovery. There's a real discovery.
Yes.
There? I mean, this is what you're describing. It's like when there is this quality of openness and freshness in our meetings, this is the kind of relating that I was alluding to. It really welcomes forward, whatever is alive and real in the other, and this is the beauty then. Then there's a beautiful exchange that happens. We can't even say who's giving and who's receiving, right? There's a flow. And that's the beauty of intimacy, isn't it?
Yes.
Right. Yes. There's a discovery, there's an exchange, and there's a learning and a growth and a healing, that comes out of that wakeful way of relating. It's deeply nourishing. And it's interesting because, many of us have had difficult relationships growing up with our parents, deficiencies in certain areas, like issues around what psychologists call attachment tendencies. And what's interesting is, as we deepen into being, these have a way of unfolding and unpacking themselves, and we're more available to people, and we begin those kind of natural and healing bonds are created and restored as well.
So tell us a little bit, since you're mentioning healing. Speak to that in the context of relating.
Well, I think we experience a lot of metaphoric wounding growing up, ways that we don't feel seen or heard in a kind and accurate way, ways that we don't feel held, or ways that we've been abused as well. And we defend against that because it's painful and disorienting and dysregulating. And in our defenses, and some of them are conscious decisions that we make to distrust others, and often it happens subconsciously, a kind of shutting down. And the heart is especially sensitive to being seen and received in a loving way, and reacts when we aren't as well, and a kind of shutting down happens on various levels. And then we go about our lives kind of in our suit of armor, often unknowingly, and feel ourselves angry or depressed or anxious or ashamed. This is what this is the armoring, that protects the vulnerable areas that feel wounded as well. And so when we are able to enter into a loving relationship, a relationship that's kinder and where we do feel seen and received as we are, this begins to melt. We feel safe more to be who we are. And This is part of the healing process, a slow disarmoring, if you will, a kind of melting. We are disarmed, you know, when we're in a loving and kind relationship and treated with some respect and honored. And a kind of melting is invited to happen. And in that melting, there's a letting go of our old defenses and opening up of areas of vulnerability, a learning actually to realize that there's nothing essentially flawed or lacking in ourself. And this is really, I think, the fundamental healing, is the healing to know that we're not fundamentally lacking or flawed. And so there's a self-acceptance and a self-loving that comes out of that. So relationships, adult relationships, can help repair that. And sometimes that can happen spontaneously as we deepen in our own awakening process. And I find it interactive or complementary in the sense that as we deepen in our own self-intimacy, and it may be psychological work, and as our defenses melt, we're actually more available to being, simply being as we are, as ourself. And as we're more attuned with being and at ease with being, so the psyche that are wanting to be touched with love and understanding arise as well. To be healed, to be met with love and understanding, and to dissolve and integrate. And then that allows more light to come into the system and a greater intimacy with being. And, you know, so it's a complementary and interactive cycle, I found. So, yeah, some people approach it more from the spiritual direction first, and then find themselves doing more psychological work, and others may approach it more psychologically and then find themselves deepening into being as well. But if we're going to live in an integrated way and a greater self-intimacy, then you know, at some point the psychological material would need to be touched and liberated, I would say.
So I'm going to be a bit provocative, Jon, and I'll just say the way that you've presented this integration, this healing, this liberation, sounds very beautiful. And, you know, as I've experienced it, as I've seen it in others, you know, the one place that brings out old stuff is usually conflict. You know, so the it's almost like the catalyst for release, for healing, for liberation is usually conflict. Would you agree to that? Or is that overstating the case?
It's probably true. Yeah, it's probably true in as much as I think there are two probably main drivers to self-awareness, you know, and one is the love of truth and the other is crises. And I would say conflict, relational conflicts would definitely fall into the second category. You know, the conflict may be that we don't have a relationship, you know, and we feel, you know, deficient because of that, and that may create, you know, a kind of crisis. Or we may be in a relationship and we find ourselves very unhappy as well, playing out our old defenses, or having picked someone who fits an old pattern that we're trying to win them over, getting them to love us. You know, someone who really is pretty unavailable. That's a very common conflict that we get into. And then that becomes a kind of wake-up call. We begin to see if it's a pattern of conflict, not just with one individual who may be inappropriate, but a series of individuals, then that conflict may become an opportunity then to take a good look at what our defenses are, what our stories are, and to begin taking a closer look. So yeah, anything, you know, everything actually is a wake-up call. everything is teaching us. Everything is an opportunity to be more intimate in our self-knowing.
Yes.
And certainly conflict in relationship would qualify for that.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not even talking about big scale conflict. I'm talking about everyday little, eh,
Yeah, little arguments. And,
yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to get big, but somehow there's something that's jarring, and that's the wake up call. That's like, okay, what's happening here?
Often we like to be right.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's an attachment. It can be an attachment to that as well. We also like to be validated. Right? We like to be recognized in a certain way, that fits with our own self-image. So it's interesting just to see, okay, so what image of myself may I be defending here? How is it that I want to be seen?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And of course, it's not unusual that we have a secret judgment within ourselves, that the other may be mirroring to us. And so it may bring a deep investigation, or maybe just a fairly quick inquiry as well. I mean, one really valuable tool I find in relationship is Byron Katie's work.
Yes.
As well, to ask ourselves, what is it that we can't stand in the other? How should they be or shouldn't they be? And is that really true? And what's the effect of holding on to this belief? And who would I be without it? And then there's always the interesting reversal or turnaround, to see, how am I holding this judgment against myself as well? That's a very liberating inquiry. So if we're getting into little arguments and conflicts or misunderstandings, that's a really valuable tool. And I find also, and we may have talked about this before, it's really interesting when we're in touch with what our story may be about ourselves or others, to just let our attention come to our heart. And in a very innocent way, ask ourselves, what's my deepest knowing about this? And then be quiet. And it's like we're checking in with our heart wisdom. And very often, and it may come as a word, or it may come as a feeling or a sensation or just a direct knowing. We get to the truth of the matter very quickly. So what's my deepest knowing here?
Yeah, that's beautiful. I like that.
Because usually almost always the argument is up here. It's if we actually, it's so interesting because we'll argue in our minds, with that person after, we've had the exchange. You can watch the mind trying to justify itself. Oh, I wish I had said this, or don't they realize that? Or we spend so much time doing that. But what's interesting is to notice where the localization of attention is. It's up here, and it has to do with thinking and also maintaining a certain self-image. And so by shifting attention here, we actually enter into a much more intimate relationship with ourselves, and by extension with others as well.
Yes. Yeah. Beautiful.
So, my wife and I practice this informally. We bump into each other every once in a while, and but we're both very dedicated to dropping below our stories and the truth of things. And so conflicts tend to not come up that often and tend to get resolved very quickly. Humor is a good way of dealing with it as well. Not to take ourselves so seriously, and be playful, at these times as well. When we're talking about smaller things as well. And if we're talking about more serious conflicts, then it's really important to, this is just basic, that we step into the other's shoes, that we be willing to, not because we agree with them necessarily, but we're just willing to see things from their point of view.
Yes.
So that's what empathy is, and So to be quick to empathize and slow to justify, you know, ourselves is really helpful.
Mm.
To be willing to hear another's subjective truth, and and be willing to express what I sometimes call the unarguable truth. In other words, just the truth of my experience, not my opinion of you or my judgment of you, but just, what's going on here with me. So that keeps the field very clear. And, when I don't do much in the work of couples work anymore. I used to do a fair amount of it. But when I'd work with couples, I would say, let's put down our shields and spears, and just speak in a very simple and vulnerable way about our own experience and trust the movement of truth. Like if we both get what's deeply true, the relationship will find its natural form and will deepen in intimacy, and it may transform. Lovers may become friends, for instance, because that's a truer form.
Yes.
And one last point here. I'm covering a lot of different points, but
it's beautiful. Thank you for sharing this.
Yeah, is that as we go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's just that you're speaking to the heart of the human experience, and you're sharing of the fullness of yours, and that's very valuable.
You're very welcome. What I was going to say is that as we deepen in our self-intimacy and in our integrity, our relationships change accordingly. And so if we've been in close relationships that are in integrity with the truth, then those will deepen and maintain. And if we've been in relationships that aren't, they tend to fall away, or we have less contact with those people. And this is one of the great fears of people, is that if they deepen into self-intimacy, that they will lose connection with others. This is a really important point, because I encounter this again and again in my spiritual mentoring work, and in my work, in my counseling work as well. There's a deep fear of losing what we think of as connection. But we're really not losing. We can never lose anything essential. But relationships that are not essential tend to transform, and that's the truth of it.
Yes. Maybe I'll just share what I'm living right now. I've lived by myself for the last, I don't know, maybe 15 years. And I've just moved in with a very dear friend of mine, my best friend. And there's been plenty of conflict since we moved in, because we tend to have very different views about some issues.
Sure. Inevitably.
Yes. And this brings up very deep patterns of avoiding conflict in me, wanting to avoid conflict. And of course that doesn't work at all. So I get to see all this stuff. And at the same time, it's like, what I find is when I really just listen, there is no conflict. I mean, there's simply what the experience and the views are over there, and there's the experience and the views that are here. And there's it's almost like whatever, what I keep seeing is that when I stop taking issue, just like you mentioned, Byron Katie, if I stop taking issues, whatever it is expressed by my friend, there really isn't a problem. There's just differing views, differing experiences.
Yeah.
And it's, it's by no means easy right now for me, but it's so humbling in a good way.
It is. It's very humbling, isn't it? You at the beginning, at the outset, you described me as humble. It's only after many defeats.
Yes.
It's true. It's when attention really drops deep into the heart, into silence, there are no conflicts. There are no arguments with reality, and this is our home ground. Right? And it's important to return to that non-place of the heart as our foundation, and then feel what's a natural expression that comes from this, because we do need to set boundaries as human beings, and this is another kind of area of misunderstanding, I would say, which is people think, well, if all is one, then what's the use of boundaries? Reality is unboundaried, and at the essential level, it's true. But on the relative level, as individual body minds, boundaries are essential for existence.
Yes.
Whether we're a single cell, an amoeba, or a complex human being, we're constantly adapting to the environment, and we have our yeses and our nos as well.
Yes.
But the question is, where do they come from? Do they come from a position, a need to be right? Do they come from the past, from old patterns that we're superimposing on the present? Or are they coming from this moment, from a deep knowing and availability, and without needing to make the other wrong as well? And those are quite natural and appropriate. And most people will be quite appreciative if we can communicate those in a clear and loving way.
Yes. I mean, there's a simplicity to these yeses and nos that
increasingly.
It simply is like this. And there's an innocence even to
there is. It's innocent and it's simple, and we all have our preferences. We like certain colors over others. We like certain foods over others. We like certain temperatures over others. We like, whatever it may be. We're going to have our differences, aren't we? And it's totally natural. And it's sometimes one of the things I've been, in a way, practicing. It's not like a formal spiritual practice, but in my relationship, I've been practicing just what it's like to let go of my preferences from time to time. And just feel, not that I would do it all the time, not that I would be, constantly give into the others, but it's just like as an interesting practice, what's it like to give up my preference from time to time, and just experience that as well.
Yes, yes, beautiful.
It's interesting, yeah.
Yes,
and it's very different than, say, merging with the other. It's not like I'm giving it up in order to accommodate you, to make you happy, to avoid conflict, in order to fear, out of fear of abandonment. It's not that at all.
No.
It's more like a practice in my own simplicity, my own willingness to be unattached from time to time to my preferences.
Well, and also a kind of just playing with, what is it like, like you mentioning temperature. I mean, differences,
we have our comfort zones, right?
Exactly. So I get to practice taking clothes off because my friend's comfortable.
Exactly.
And I get to also give up my beliefs about saving energy and that kind of stuff. So
that's right.
Very, very interesting, juicy kind of stuff.
It is. And it's amazing how attached we do get to these, ways of being.
And it seems that the older we get, the more we get attached, right?
we have our ways, right? we have our special ways. Yeah.
Yes. So, Jon, this feels like a good time, and I'm also aware of time to bring on people.
Sure.
I'll bring in people. So, inviting you to, I'm just going to post the link to the Hangout. Oops. Okay. Posting the link to the Hangout on the website. And if you would like to ask a question to Jon on the YouTube comment thread, you're welcome to do that too. Whatever form or way seems the best way to you. Let's see. Just give me, Jon, you can take a minute. And I'm just going about my technical business here. Let's see. It's not posted yet. Okay. Trying again here. There we are. Okay. I'm publishing the link. So if you reload your web page with the links, you should be able to find the link to the Hangout. And I'm also going to go to the YouTube page to see whether there are any questions or comments. Let's see. Okay, there's quite a... Wayne Weir says, hello to all. Good morning. Almost afternoon from rainy Seattle, Washington. Lee says, hey Wayne, it's Lee here in cloudy Florida. And Ved says, good night from Spain, Victoria. Jerome, love from a winterly Germany. Wonderful to join. Jane Ferris, thank you for the retreat, Grace. Blessings from Santa Rosa, California.
Oh, that's not far from me.
Yes. Wayne says he would like to bump the thanks to Grace for doing this retreat. It's been delightful. Blessings to all. Tia says good evening from Dublin, Ireland. So April says namaste from FSJ. Not sure what that is, April. FSJ, BC, Canada. Ved has a question. My question is, are humility and patience a path to intimacy, and how? Are humility and patience a path to intimacy, and how are they so?
Well, humility is, it's not really an attitude. It's not a mental attitude. It's actually a byproduct, I would say, of letting go of who we think we are and our images and our stories. It's a stripping away. It's an unveiling, and it leaves us more and more in just openness. I'm getting an echo
Wayne,
here.
yes, I know. Wayne, you have to shut down your YouTube page.
Okay.
Can you make sure you shut it down? I've muted you, but if I unmute you, it's gonna interfere again. So just shut down your YouTube watch page, please. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's just through a natural process of self-examination and self-inquiry. These veils begin to naturally fall away. We see through them. We see that we're not who we've taken ourselves to be. Not at all. Who we are is actually inconceivable and unimaginable. And so we feel unveiled increasingly and stripped, and it brings just a kind of natural simplicity, which we could speak of as humility as well. And with that, there's also an openness to what life brings, a willingness to accept what life brings to us, and that's the patience as well. Again, not a contrived patience, not a I should be patient or I should be humble, but these are just natural byproducts of our deep self-investigation and letting go, and this makes us available to our partners and our friends. We're able to listen much more openly. We don't need to contradict or interrupt. We're interested in understanding as well, and that's on relative levels of intimacy, and most importantly, as we let go of who we think we are, and feel and know ourselves as being, we actually resonate with others in that same way, and in a very natural way. And this is the intimacy, the great intimacy that we're speaking of. It's an intimacy beyond words, and it's an intimacy at the very core of the heart, I would say. In other words, it's love that we feel, and it's true. It's true not just with other human beings, but we feel it actually generalizing to all beings and to what we call the world as well. Not just others, but otherness at all. There's a feeling of meeting ourself really in and as form.
I wonder, Jon, whether it's worth also mentioning that the love and the intimacy that is felt is deeper than emotional. You know,
Mm-hmm. It is.
There's a peace to it that somehow is very different, and a depth to it that's very different from an emotional feeling of intimacy.
Well, that's why I kind of differentiated levels earlier on that we can meet on: mental and emotional and physical and subtle energetic, and then this essential level. So it is foundational. It's the source of all these other ways of experiencing, including an emotional intimacy as well. And so there's a quality of, here's where words fail, you know, and but there's a quality of, as you said, contentment or peace. There's a quality of joy for no reason at all. You know, that's the beauty of it. A sense of fullness is another way to describe it. There is a warmth to it, though. There's often when we first touch awareness, and it differs for different people, but often there's a quality of clarity and openness and space and infinity. And it tends to be experienced more up here. But as it drops down into the heart, as we wake down, or as the heart awakens first, there's a warmer quality to it. And so we begin to understand the true meaning of love, you know? It's not a personal love. This is the curious thing to the mind. We could speak of it as impersonal love, but often impersonal implies coldness, and it's not the case at all. There's a beautiful warmth, but it doesn't have the attachment of emotional love to it. It's really interested in the freedom and well-being of others. So it's not self-centered or self-referential either.
Yes, I really resonate with this way of expressing it. Thank you, Jon. If you want to ask back, feel free to ask back on the YouTube thread. Victoria. And in the meantime, I think I'm going to call on Wayne. Wayne, would you like to come on with a question? You're unmuted.
Hello to everyone. No, I don't think I have a particular question. Just enjoying the conversation and noticing the resistance coming up within myself just from the discussion itself, you know, that vulnerable part of me, the me, the little me, you know, feeling vulnerable, literally just delving this deeply into these portions of ourselves and sharing that in the group. It's very beautiful. Thank you, Jon.
I appreciate, Wayne, your sharing that vulnerability, and I imagine you're not the only one who feels that. And this vulnerability is actually a portal, I would say. Oh, you have a little friend. Is that your cat behind you? Or your dog?
That's my dog, Rascal. Yes.
Okay, Rascal.
Hello, Rascal. Yes, that's Rascal and Yogi.
Rascal and Yogi. Hi, guys.
Yes.
The vulnerability that we feel.
I'm sorry. Someone honked their horn back there. Sorry.
The vulnerability that we feel is a doorway or a portal to our depths, and usually we avoid it. You know, we distract ourselves or we defend against it. But as our understanding deepens, we realize this is the way in, actually. And it leads us to a different kind of strength. Not the strength of wearing a suit of armor and being invulnerable on a relative level to others, but a strength that comes from the core of our being. And it's very interesting that the vulnerability actually leads to, you know, this radiance and this stability that is an expression of our inherent nature. So I invite you to breathe into your vulnerability and feel into it, and to be curious about what's in the very center of it. This is part of self-inquiry that includes the somatic and emotional dimension. To really feel into the core of your experience, to be intimate with your experience. And this is really the foundation of intimacy with others. This willingness to feel, this willingness to sense, this desire to know what's really true, what's in the very center of this. And you will be surprised, I guarantee it.
Are you willing to pick up that gauntlet?
I am, Grace. I was already thinking before even speaking that right after the session, I was going to perhaps go meditate on these feelings of resistance and practice some self-inquiry there. I mentioned yesterday that I had my first awakening experience about 4 years ago, and so it's like, I'm kind of trapped in these two worlds now. There's these moments where I'm completely quote unquote awake, and then I'm back to playing Wayne again, and then I'm back to being awake again. And this has brought forth in me some things that I can certainly see are holding me back. And I appreciate that. That's the most valuable thing to me now, is finding those pockets of resistance.
Exactly, and that's why this back and forth process is happening, actually, because there are moments or periods of clarity when we know who we are, and then a recrystallization of identity. And it's not a mistake. It doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. It's actually a very natural part of this process of being a more.
The recrystallization is natural, you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's a more thorough. It's about this being a thorough process. And so when we feel, we become interested in how we unenlighten ourselves.
Yes.
We get attached to the old stories, and we get attached to the old feelings, and without judging. This is really important. We're less and less judgmental about the whole process, more and more accepting, more curious, and more affectionate with it. And that optimizes the unfolding of the process as well. And vulnerability is a very important part of this. Honesty, self-honesty, and self-vulnerability. It's really up to us. We are the keepers of the flame of our inner knowing. We tend this hearth of our essential nature, and your commitment to that is beautiful. I can feel it.
Thank you. It expresses itself as a feeling of inevitability. That it's no longer a question of whether or not all of Wayne is going to be seen through at some point. It's just a question of when. It's like it's screaming, That's
right. There's a momentum here.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. There is.
Yeah. And your head is in the mouth of the tiger.
It certainly is. And it's like being born again. It really is.
This is the real rebirth. This is the true rebirth.
Yes. You have to learn how to walk again, how to talk again. You literally have to learn how to be again. Because everything that you thought you were, that you thought you knew,
it's not true.
Useless. Absolutely useless. Yes, sir.
So the whole body mind reorients, and reorganizes itself around this understanding and this revelation. That's right. And it's a process that takes time. Actually, if it goes too quickly, it becomes overwhelming as well. So we begin to respect the pace that the body mind adjusts to discovery of our true nature.
Oh, well, thank you for that. I'm so glad you said that. That there have been times, moments when the awakening would reach a certain point, and I would want it to stop, because I felt overwhelmed by it. And then then comes another period of inquiry after that about, okay, well, what was resisting that? What's resisting it this time?
That's right. There are many levels of resistance.
Oh, there are. And then the mind begins to jump in and question, okay, is there an end point at all? Or is this an infinite game of hide and seek between myself and my non-self?
Well, what I would say...
is there a new guy?
Yeah, what I would say is at a certain point, there's a shift in the gravity of identification to who we really are. And but the body mind, I think, will continually adjust and refine to this understanding, and I think that's a lifelong process. That's been my experience. It's just like encountering deeper subconscious somatic levels, that open up to the light of awareness, to the light of our inner being, and are transformed by them. And so the embodiment process, really more and more having the body-mind saturated with this understanding seems to me to be open-ended.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, it's so hard, other than, you know, in a satsang setting such as this, to find information about the embodiment process. Most of the books and materials you find online are aimed at pointing someone toward that first awakening experience. You know,
That's
they're
right.
just, they're basically just concepts to reverse the conceptual me and open the mind up to that
Yes.
first awakening experience. And it's
That's
not
right.
that you can't still dig through them later and find little nuggets in there that'll make something click in you. You certainly can. But as it grows and as it moves, it becomes much more personal, much more, I've got to dig completely into the me. I can't rely on Grace and Jon and Jac O'Keeffe and all of the great people who have helped move my life. I have to, this has to be done. This is all here.
That's right.
And,
it's all in you. It's all in you. And this is our sacred responsibility. And, teachers can point us to this, it can help orient us and support us, but this is our sacred responsibility to assist and support this unfolding.
And I just want to throw in there, it's a sacred responsibility, but it's also such a deep joy.
And joy.
Because you discover how you can be this awakeness, this love, so much more fully, so much more deeply, through all these little, these little conflicts and resistances and, innocent ignorances that show up. And wow, it just becomes more and more beautiful, Wayne. Who wouldn't want to do this?
It's true. Yeah. There's more joy.
Yes. I was stuck for a while in this place where every time egoic consciousness would resurface, there's such resistance to it, to shifting back in that place and accepting the fact that it doesn't seem that the me has any control over whether there's egoic consciousness or awake consciousness in the moment. And yet it appears that maybe I do have a little control. I can read the right thing or watch the right video and it'll click again. Trying to figure out if I'm doing anything at all here, or is this completely out of my hands?
Both are true.
It's very frustrating for me at times. Yeah.
Right. Both are true. It's like it's all grace, not Grace Bubeck necessarily, but divine grace. It's all grace, and it may feel at some point like we're doing, right? And that at some point, and it's often a kind of spectrum, it feels like, am I doing or is it doing? It's just doing is happening. Yes. We're drawn more and more spontaneously, to do or not do whatever we're doing or not doing. And,
yes,
it's more like that, there is this transitional period when there's the question of who's doing what. But what is, I think the quality of attention we bring to our experience becomes increasingly less goal-oriented, less judgmental, increasingly more affectionate and curious. And these are qualities of presence. These are qualities of our true nature. And
the ego reacts to that as well.
Sure.
It's like Grace mentioned earlier that, my interpretation of what she was talking about when discussing the conflict with her new living roommate, I no longer feel drawn to even engage in conflict of any kind anymore. I don't feel like there's any worth in it. I don't feel like there's a place to take a stand.
That's right.
I'm okay with whatever is going on at the moment. And that was, if you would have asked the old me 5 years ago, would you like to have that? I would have said, oh, please give it to me now. Well, and then the ego turns around and says, well, no, you should be involved in some way or another, you should. And as you mentioned earlier, there certainly are boundaries in life. We are playing the game, whether we want to be playing the game or whether we are enjoying playing the game, or, so there's the adjustment to the emptiness of just being, as opposed to feeling like everything that I am hangs in the balance of the moment. I no longer feel that at all. It's like,
yeah,
not concerned with what anyone says or thinks about me, or
right. What a relief.
And when it is, it's just it's odd to see the ego turn around and try to crawl into that, now and say, okay, well now that's a problem.
Right. Yeah.
It comes in the front door. When you close the front door, it comes in the back door. When you close the back door, it comes in through the heating vents, and then it comes down the chimney. It's a very clever little guy.
Yeah. The separate self is always appropriating whatever insights and experiences arise. And then after, gradually it doesn't.
Appropriate,
to take over, to take credit for it.
Yeah, identifying with it and taking credit, owning it.
Own it. It owns it. That's mine. Awakening. It's my awakening. I'm awake.
Yeah. I love that one.
Yeah, I'm awake.
I know a secret. Yeah. It manifested initially as this feeling that I knew a secret, I know the secret and nobody else knows,
Exactly.
I know the secret that none of this really matters and everyone thinks it does. And and it was a beautiful honeymoon period for a while.
That's it. That's right. It's a honeymoon. Right. It's the I'm special.
Now we're washing the dishes and we're paying the bills and we're.
That's right.
We're in the nitty gritty.
That's right. Yeah. Into the nitty gritty. Yeah. Beautiful. Very nice.
And it's part of the nitty gritty that ego shows up every once in a while.
Yeah, that's exactly where it shows up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's always a surprise to find it, and it's pleasant to find it because it's well, now I can go look over there for a little while and see what turns up. So thank you, Jon, and thank you, Grace.
You're very welcome, Wayne.
And if you move with that, you're no longer stuck between being awake and the ego showing up. You're just moving with that unfolding of the ego showing up and you having an opportunity to. Yes. Mm-hmm. So and then, next time it comes in through the chimney, you look at it again.
That's the way Santa arrives.
Yeah. The question is whether he has a bag of toys or a lump of coal.
Well, you get to play with the coal.
Yeah, you can. can certainly start a fire with it. The
Wayne,
so
I'd like to move on because there's another question on the YouTube thread.
Thank you, Grace. And
I'd like to bring Lee on too after that. Actually, there's 2 more questions. So Victoria's, actually, I'll get to Victoria next. Birgit says, is there something you can say about misunderstandings and how to facilitate a sense of spaciousness?
I think I would need to know more about that question, what's being referred to as misunderstandings. But what I would say is, whatever we're experiencing, presumably this is an experience of being misunderstood by someone else. You can clarify that if that's not the case.
Yes, Birgit, if you want to come back on the YouTube comment thread, please do.
Mm-hmm. A couple of things. I mean, on a more psychological level, it's always interesting to kind of examine the experience of being misunderstood and just tolerate it, because we are frequently misunderstood. We're not accurately seen or mirrored. And, but what's most important is that we not misunderstand ourselves. So whatever we're experiencing, what we call a misunderstanding, we may have some thoughts about that. We may have feelings about that. We may have sensations about that. And all of those are actually important to acknowledge. It's like, what am I experiencing on a feeling level? What am I experiencing on a somatic level or body level? What am I thinking, right? And then become intimate with that. And there's kind of three ways that I commonly do that. And one is actually just sense our sensations. Okay, what's the sensation of being misunderstood? How does that feel in my body? Be willing to sense it. The feeling of it, being willing to feel the sense of being misunderstood. And then questioning whatever our beliefs are that are being, that may arise in that experience. And all of this is happening in awareness. Right? We're aware of feelings, we're aware of sensations, we're aware of thoughts. What is it that's aware? This is where we find our spaciousness. So part of it is just the stepping back, being aware of what the elements of our experience are as thoughts and feelings and sensations, and shifting our attention to that which is aware and letting it rest there for a while. Now, sometimes if the misunderstanding is very intense, we're not able to step back from it and experience that sense of space, in which case we actually need to go through it. And we may need to feel into the core of the feeling. We may need to really carefully investigate what story or image we have about ourselves, that we're, for instance, flawed in some way or lacking in some way that's being triggered by the misunderstanding, and ask ourselves what's really true. And this is a stepping through experience, So space can be discovered, and spaciousness, which is always inherent, through 2 complementary paths. One is the stepping back and just being aware of the field of awareness within which everything arises. And the other is stepping through and going right through the heart of the sensation and the feeling and questioning the belief. And we will always come to a sense of space, which is really interesting. No matter how tight the contraction is, there's space in the center of it. So these are, in a general way, ways to deal with so-called misunderstanding.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jon. And Birgit, if you want to, if you feel, you can come back to Jon on this. So I'll move on.
Maybe I'll say a little bit more about this, because it's an important point and one that I've explored a lot with people. there can be a way when we are upset that we use our spiritual understanding and experience to avoid it. Commonly called spiritual bypassing. I think it's a misnomer. I think it's more mental bypassing, because spirit doesn't bypass anything. It's implicit and inherent in everything. But the mind uses our understanding of spirituality maybe to distance from our experience or from the other person who is, the apparent, provocateur of our experience. And I think it's really important, this is where the vulnerability and honesty comes in, to see if we're using our spiritual understanding and practice as a way of avoiding our experience, as a way of distancing from it. And if we are, to begin actually to lean forward into our experience, to become more familiar with our feelings and with our sensations and with the core beliefs that are often operating on a subconscious level, and to see and feel and sense our way through those as well. So that was a point I just wanted to make, that it's common for people who are uncomfortable in relationship to isolate themselves, to distance themselves in order not to be disturbed. And at some point we have to face whatever it is that we're avoiding.
Yes, it's thank you for clarifying. That's a really good way of clarifying that notion of spiritual bypassing. And from my own experience, I can really only confirm that the reason why it felt so right to go into this experience of sharing a home with another person was because somehow I had become so comfortable by myself that there was just a call to face that challenge of having to interact with somebody else, having to share, having to face my own preferences, beliefs, whatever, in this way. And so, my senses life just gives us exactly what we're ready for.
Yeah, you felt a calling, a readiness to do this. Yes. And so your time of living alone was actually perfect. Yes. It was what you needed and what was appropriate. And then at a certain point, it became obvious, yes, to have a housemate, have your friend as a housemate. And life will move in either direction. We may be, involved in a relationship intimately with someone, and then for years, and then have a period. It really feels natural to have time by ourselves, really, yes, and really be by ourselves and have that opportunity to be more intimate with that silence and that interiority itself. And it's interesting because many of these traditions that have emphasized awakening come from renunciate and monastic backgrounds, mostly Eastern, not entirely. We see some of it in Western religious traditions, but even those are monastic and renunciate. And so what is it to bring this wakefulness into our ordinary Western lives, which generally include work and relationship, and work is often about relationship too. So this is the challenge that we have as Westerners in bringing this depth understanding, these wisdom and love teachings into very ordinary circumstances, and discover the sacred in the ordinary, I would say, and the sacred in our partners and the sacred in our friends, and above all within ourselves. But it's because we are so relationally oriented as human beings, this to me seems like the most challenging and interesting area in which to integrate this understanding as well.
Beautiful. And I think that in that Western way, the Eastern teachings, the monastic traditions actually get enriched amazingly, because somehow this learning was confined to a monastic context. Because, of course, in a monastic context, unless you're really living in a cave in the mountain by yourself,
you're also in a community, aren't you?
You're also in a community.
Yeah.
You know, but somehow the crucible of this experience was confined to the monastic, and directed by spiritual directors, obviously, but or by masters. You know, if we're talking about a guru-disciple relationship. But now it's like bringing this into everyday life, bringing this into the life of the householder.
And the hierarchy between teacher and student is changing too.
Yes.
And the role of the teacher, and it's really, we're much more oriented towards the inner teacher, the inner guidance, and outer teachers are just more or less in touch with their inner guidance and have a provisional role. It can be helpful to support and point out, but it's changing. All these different roles and identities and forms are adapting to more Western modes, Western and householder modes of living.
Yes, yes. So just going back to the YouTube thread, there's some things have shown up there. Jerome asks a question, or maybe just a comment. Here's your friend Jeroen from Germany. Beautiful, intimate sharing as always, dear brother.
Oh, hi, Jeroen.
Sorry, I totally mispronounced your name.
He's Dutch. You got pretty close.
Yes.
He's a beautiful guy.
Yes, so he says further, my experience is that one can feel deeply in touch with one's inner knowing or truth. And yet it seems to be no guarantee of encountering resonance in the area of intimate relationship. So it also appears to remain one of life's big mysteries, how and when certain karmic connections come to fruition. Maybe you could comment on that?
I think I would just echo it. It is quite a mysterious process, to meet others who share, in this deep resonance. It's beautiful when it happens. We feel a friendship, a deep friendship, kind of sacred friendship as well. But how that happens, as Jeroen is suggesting, is really quite mysterious, and as is life, isn't it? As is the unfolding of all of life. So as we deepen into our true nature, it feels like all sorts of possibilities and potentialities come to the surface that we would have been unthinkable before. Opportunities arise, connections happen that are totally unexpected. We find ourselves living more and more in this kind of open mystery and at ease in our own being. And certain people show up, sometimes quite remarkably. In this case, Jeroen and I met maybe 3 years ago or so through a mutual friend. And there was this immediate resonance. There was this sense of deep knowing that we shared. And it's been very beautiful to have this spiritual friendship, for lack of a better word. But how did that happen? Just quite mysteriously. But the beauty is that we trust in this more and more. The mind is always wanting to know, is always planning, and trying to optimize experience, avoid pain and enhance pleasure and all of that. This is the job of the mind, to kind of figure out how is all this working. But increasingly we just deepen into trust, trusting in the unfolding of life and trusting life no matter what. And this is so counter our conditioning of survival, because we're so survival oriented, whether we realize it or not. And in this unpacking and unveiling and this self-intimacy, we deepen into this unconditional trust of life. And then life brings the unexpected. People come we never knew about, never imagined existed. And friendships and lovers, friends and lovers appear, and colleagues, and it's really remarkable how that works, and I can't pretend to know how it does. But when there's an openness deeply within ourselves, somehow that just naturally constellates experience and draws kindred spirits to us.
Thank you, Jon. And I'm afraid we're going to have to come to a close. There's another question from Birgit, and I'm aware we haven't gotten to the second question from Victoria, but I really, we have another session at the full hour. So I just wanted to include Lee quickly. Lee, do you have any question for Jon?
I have a very long and complicated question. No, I'm just kidding. I'll just say thank you, Jon, for sharing. And
you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lee, for graciously letting us off the hook. So I'm sorry that we can't get to your questions, Victoria and Birgit. Maybe you can post them again in the next session with Gail, and we'll see what answer comes what response comes forth then.
Yeah. Gail's a friend of mine also.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
Lovely being.
Jon, it's so amazing to me. I hadn't thought about it, but somehow there's this whole Californian crowd that I ended up inviting for this retreat. Because there just seems to be so much awakeness and light in California, so many people are there. So that's what it was for that retreat. So that's perfect. And I'd like to thank you so much, Jon. It's always just so deeply beautiful to have you come and share. And I'm sure that's everybody who appreciates that, the way that presence and love and awakeness expresses through you. There's something just so touchingly actually intimate in your sharing. That connects, that communicates itself. So I really want to thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. You're very welcome. Would it be okay to mention a few events that I'm offering?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
So for those of you who are on the West Coast or in California, I will be offering some residential retreats next year in the Valley in January, and Esalen in May, and the Santa Cruz Mountains at the end of July and beginning of August. So my website has all that information at listeningfromsilence.com. And then also I do have a book called In Touch, and covers many of the points that we talked about today, and importance of relationship and self-intimacy, and so on. So if you're interested in exploring more deeply, that's a good source.
Yeah, and you find also the information in Jon's bio on the page that says teachers on the website. So you get also the link to his website. And that's true also for the other teachers. So you can follow up whoever maybe spoke to you deeply from this retreat. So thank you to all of you who came on the Hangout and asked your questions, and thank you to Jon again.
Thank you, Grace. It was beautiful to be with you.
Yeah, beautiful to be with you all. And I'll see you again in 15 minutes time. Until then, bye-bye.